Video games are all about agency, players having the ability to enact their will within virtual worlds, often without any sexy constraints, at least as long as you're willing to grind hard enough.
Speaking of grinding though, agency also plays a large role in sex, particularly concerning consent, which you need to have good sex.
Discussions of who can do what we can put where, who likes what, or what it takes to reach the climax of the adventure are all discussions that happen in both gaming and sex.
And all of that gets even more complicated when we talk about sex within gaming.
Games create interesting questions around bodily autonomy and sexual consent, mainly because a group of people, developers, set the rules and define the extent of agency that the player and other people in the situation have. Whether it's the wild freedom of sex on demand in the open world of CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk 2077, or the more linear directed experience of Double Fine's Psychonauts 2. So, what does consent mean in video games? Where are the lines of agency between the player and the non-player character as well as the developers, and how is power defined in the worlds games allow us to inhabit?
So, let's get comfortable and talk about consent in video games and consider whether we can do it better. So before we get deeper, since we are talking about consent, let me tell you what you're consenting to when you watch this video. Obviously, we'll be talking about sex and sexual situations, however, there will be no nudity. There will, though, be mentions of issues relating to sexual assault, though we won't be describing anything in detail. And since we're talking about games, we will have a few minor spoilers for these games that are on the screen right now, though there will be no major plot beats spoiled for any of them. And by telling you all what will be in this video, I've already demonstrated an important part of consent. Consent is all about making clear and setting expectations of what you can expect and allowing you to choose to disengage, such as if you choose to stop watching this video due to what I've described as its content. But what does all that look like in a sexual context?
The simple definition of sexual consent is someone actively, and emphasis on the word actively there, agreeing to have sex with someone. Both parties must agree to a sexual act of their own free will for it to be consensual.
Now, that seems simple enough, but it gets more complicated. Because you see, in video games, a common issue in how consent is depicted is that it often isn't.
As with many films and TV shows, characters will get ready to do the naked tango, and then they'll just start going for it. Take for example this scene in Uncharted 2 with Chloe and Drake. Chloe climbs on top of Drake and even puts his hand on her butt. But he seems surprised by this, and she didn't ask if it was okay for her to do that. In Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Katarina just comes into Ezio's bath and starts making out with him as the music, as well as presumably other things, swell.
Now, all of this does not mean that these are inherently bad sex scenes. They're actually quite good in a lot of cases. They showcase good character interactions and highlight close relationships that will be important to the story later on. And they're also just a little bit steamy. The problem is that these scenes depict consent as implicit, or something that happens off-screen, and don't show people who play the games what it looks like. Or it also implies that sex is something that we're supposed to intuit that our partners are interested in, rather than actually verbally communicating with them. And sex does and should take a lot of communication, and that's not a bad thing, nor an unsexy thing.
When we discuss consent, we often see it as at odds with romance or sexiness, but in actuality, asking for consent can be incredibly romantic.
Put your hands on me, Jack.
But quite often with most media and in video games, consent is often never depicted on screen.
While certainly we can assume these characters had spoken off-screen to communicate consent and establish boundaries beforehand, we never actually get to see that. And the problem is that this is how most sex on screen is portrayed, and due to its ubiquitousness, means consent is often treated like an afterthought in games. Notably too, these moments are often cutscenes, which act like movies or TV shows, where the choice to depict a sex act and show consent within it is often solely left to the creators authoring the sequence. Another thing the Uncharted 2 scene highlights is how men are often seen to consent simply by virtue of being men. Nathan Drake must want to have his hands on Chloe's butt because, of course, he's a guy and he would want that.
I thought you'd want to be in on the action.
It's a subtle idea that underscores how we in our society today often discuss men, as always wanting sex simply by virtue of the fact that they are men, and it depicts women as withholding consent just by the fact that they are women. Yet, not only is this dehumanizing to both men and women, it isn't true. There's an implicit message in our society that men are somehow less manly if they don't want sex. They must always want it. Having sex, and a lot of it, is a measure of one's masculinity. But in reality, it's okay for men to not always want sex, and it's okay to turn down sex even if someone else wants it from you. As I said before, sex requires enthusiastic consent from every participant who chooses to engage in it, and games should reflect this reality. However, unlike movies and TV shows, gaming is about player control, and the player can sometimes play a role in choosing to have consent in sex in a game. Take, for example, Heavy Rain. When you're not hunting for the origami killer, the two leads, Ethan and Madison, can get nice and close and sexy. But as Madison leans in for a kiss, the game stops and lets the player, who is controlling Ethan, choose to kiss the girl or not. While the characters never verbalize a discussion of consent, the player gets a choice if they wish to engage or not, and also thereby tangentially allowing the male character to choose to consent or not. Sadly, Madison's agency doesn't get much thought in the game, which may indicate certain creators behind the scenes issues around women. But it also goes to show that in a scene about sex, you're depicted as playing the man, not the woman. And this goes again to how often women in media are often depicted as the object in sex, not something or someone with agency. Overall though, this is a great scene as it highlights a player's agency in the moment. But one issue is that it depicts consent as a simple yes or no. Once you click, yes, I wish to engage in sex, the sex begins, with neither character having any conversations after that. However, with all sex, it's not usually, yeah, go ahead, you can do whatever you want with my body now that we've started. Instead, most sex during the act itself is all about asking questions and communicating with each other.
What do you like? What can I do? Is this okay? Do you like this? Can I touch that? Can I go there?
On top of all of this, consent doesn't have to happen in the moment. It can be talked about well before sex even happens, even minutes, hours, days, weeks, months before. For example, if you romance my boy Garrus in Mass Effect 2, our beautiful Turian sets up a plan with Shepard to do the naked tango.
I'll find some music and do some research to figure out how this thing should work. It'll either be a night to treasure or a horrible interspecies awkwardness thing. In which case, fighting the collectors will be a welcome distraction, so, a win either way.
From there, he even asks if he can research human sexuality, leading to his adorable nervousness.
If you were a Turian, I'd be complimenting your waist or your fringe, so your, hair looks good, and your waist is very supportive.
Yet he learns and works with Shepard about what a human woman may want and desire, and it's clearly appreciated.
I know, I appreciated it.
Sadly though, the game fades to black before sex happens.
After all that teasing, we didn't even get to see those hot calibrations.
Calibrating a giant gun is a vacation.
On top of Garrus, which is also incidentally where many of us would like to be, Mass Effect 2 will often centralize the player's agency and desire in sexual situations over the other participants, the non-player characters.
For example, while Garrus spent a lot of time learning what Shepard would want, Shepard never takes time to learn what Garrus would want.
I mean, my favorite lizard boy deserves some attention after everything.
Yeah, I hung out a lot of places last night. Your upper body, your lower body, pretty much all the parts in between.
However, rarely do non-player characters' agencies get highlighted in games.
For example, throughout the Mass Effect series, you, as Shepard, get a myriad of romance options, from sexy blue aliens to sexy green aliens. But ultimately, it's your choice who you get to bone before your final mission. Because pretty much everyone, as long as they're of a sexuality that is interested in your gender, is DTF.
We're banged, okay?
While you do have to build a relationship with each character by speaking to them several times before they'll jump in the sack with you, the understanding that most games have going in is that these discussions will lead to sex as the climax of the relationship. As such, you know what you're building towards each time you interact with a character. There's no possibility, for example, to end up in a relationship with someone where sex happens on the first date or not at all. It's all about leading to sex. Not only can this come across as though you're trying to earn sex by having conversations rather than earnestly getting to know them, but also de-emphasizes the non-player character's choice to have or not have sex, as you enter into the conversation already expecting sex if that's what you want from them, something predetermined as the outcome, rather than it being something agreed upon by both parties.
Because games allow players to interact with the world around them, the player's choice is prioritized, and NPCs are there to facilitate the player rather than having any recognizable agency of their own. And this can even happen in our real-world discussions of a game's character.
For example, the character of Judy in Cyberpunk 2077 is a lesbian, and will only desire to romance characters who both identify as a woman and have a female body type. Though interestingly, you can have a penis, showing that Judy does view trans women as women.
Yet, beyond this, some players who chose to play as a male protagonist were upset that Judy wasn't a romance option for them.
I reached out to Cyberpunk 2077's narrative director, Igor Sarzinski, to discuss this phenomenon.
I think the best sex scene we have is the one with Judy, a female partner for a queer character. She also has her preferences. She wouldn't romance anyone else. Something we actually got some slack from players that, oh, I'm a guy, why I cannot romance Judy? She's so cool. Like, because she has a preference. It's not all about you. And I think this worked pretty nicely.
Cyberpunk 2077 views Judy as an entire person, someone with desires and preferences beyond simply the need to satisfy the player's desires.
This caused dissonance for some players though, because often we aren't forced to think about NPCs' agencies as people within the game's universe. We tend to think of NPCs as being around for us, not as living for their own sake with their own preferences and perspectives and lives.
And to a degree, this is partially true. NPCs within video games are quite literally made for the player to interact with. But this attitude around NPCs often underscores a similar feeling of how we can dehumanize real-life people in discussing consent, such as, for example, how many women will be seen as wanting it simply for wearing a certain type of clothing.
Yet with Judy in Cyberpunk, her sexual preference is set before sex would even be possible for the player.
It's always like this tension between what you want to do as a creator and what is the expectation of the player. You cannot go too much against him because like people just wouldn't like their game because they expect something else. And at the same time, as a creator, you want to say something and you don't want to just like give people everything they want. And we try to find this balance. So again, we try to provide something for everyone, but at the same time, we wanted to do kind of on our like rules, let's say. And that's why we wanted characters have clear preferences, and just actually this makes them like a character that is someone with some boundaries and some again preferences. If all the non-player characters would just cater to players' needs, it makes them just not sharp enough, not clear enough as like their own separate people. And this is also what makes them authentic, I think, that they have their own like statements and ideas and opinions about the world, and not just, oh yes, player, I'll do whatever you want. Like, so I think it allowed us to create stronger characters that they actually want this and don't want something else.
And Mass Effect as well also showcased this. For example, you can't have sex with Garrus as a male shepherd, as Garrus is only interested in women.
However, Cyberpunk takes this further. The game showcases a scene where an NPC who is sexually interested in you draws consensual boundaries, but more interestingly, does so during the romantic situation itself.
Yeah, so actually there's a great example of a scene that's like, we had a lot of discussions around consent. There's this side quest when you like Johnny overtakes your body and takes his former love interest, Rogue, to a date. And then like everything in the game tells you like it's moving in this direction, like this is what's gonna happen in the end. And so they're like both into it, really trying to do it, but they have both changed, or actually Rogue has changed the most. So the sex scene kind of starts, they start to kiss, there's some action, and we almost move on to like, taking clothes off, and Rogue is like, no, actually, I cannot do it. Like, it doesn't feel right.
Johnny, I can't. It's not right.
And it was super tricky, like this moment, to not feel rapey, I guess is the word. Like, we had a lot of discussions how to show that she tries to be into it, but really deep inside she isn't. And at some moments she like places the boundary, that's like, it cannot go on. For sure, it was super important for like the player character to react to it really like in a respectful way, not trying to push her, not to move into this slimy area, let's say. And also I really love the scene because I think like the subversing this expectation of like sex will have to happen. Actually, it worked great for telling something about characters and about Rogue, who wants to go back, but then she learns that she cannot really do it, that she has changed as a person, and that like you cannot really go back in time.
This scene ultimately becomes about Rogue realizing her boundaries and setting them for Johnny, and it comes out of an emotional and realistic place for her. Johnny, who the player currently controls, wants to have sex, but he respects her boundaries. In a game that literally sold itself on giving players access to do whatever they wanted to do like no game before, it's a noticeable moment where the game limits the player and has the player respect an NPC's desires, not the player's. On top of this, we can even add another layer, as the scene is also built upon Johnny asking permission to use V's body.
Have fun, you crazy kids.
And he even points that out when Rogue turns him down.
Meaning not fair to V?
Not fair to you.
It's also interesting to note, though, that Igor stated in the interview that sex not being on the table was a subversion of expectations, which also subtly points to the fact that sex is often an expectation or an inevitability in games.
This speaks to how, generally culturally, we often think of consent as an assumed yes until told otherwise, when in actuality it should be the opposite. We should assume no until we're told otherwise. However, sadly and anger-inducingly, respecting stated boundaries is not always depicted well in media.
Media frequently depicts a pursuit of a yes, trying to get someone to consent who has already stated no already.
I can't rely on...
Say, kiss me.
Kiss me.
Many studies have shown that how sex is depicted in media can influence how we think of and conceive of sex in real life, especially considering that sex in media will be the first time that many of us encounter sex. So highlighting sex as an assumed yes and not respecting stated boundaries can lead to this sentiment being reflected in real life sexual situations because that's how people think it's supposed to be done. But games complicate this even further by implicating us as players who have agency within sexual situations. As players often have control in these situations, they're not just passive observers like they are in TVs and movies.
Games like Leisure Suit Larry often have you try to coerce women into sex despite them repeatedly telling you no.
As a result, games like this allow the player to not see yes as yes and no as no, but instead no as a potential yes if you work hard enough, which directly disrespects someone's stated boundaries.
It makes the player complicit in the act of ignoring consent, and thus can normalize it as okay to do so.
And this problem with not depicting consent isn't solely limited to sexual consent and sexual situations. Whether a situation is sexual or not, it's important that we all have agency in being able to choose what we do and what others do with our bodies.
In the original Psychonauts, the player character Raz would enter other characters' minds without permission.
So, is this where I get a speech and learn another lesson?
No. Here's your merit badge. Let us never speak of this again.
He even often enters the minds of people who cannot give informed consent, given their mental state.
Not another tracking device!
It's quite literally invasive.
But by the time we got to Psychonauts 2, the implicit invasiveness of Raz's power became much more top of mind for creator Tim Schafer.
Yeah, well, there was a big time difference between the first and second Psychonauts game. The first game, I was younger. We were just, making stuff up as we went and hadn't thought about a lot of issues. And on the second game, we were doing, I think it came out of our work on the Hollis level, Hollis's Hot Streak, where Raz goes deep into someone's mind and actually messes with things that are not his to mess with. He oversteps the bounds. And it's part of his one of the lessons he learns in this game. But he learns that he has so much power that he can cause harm that he didn't realize he could cause.
Uh-oh.
And when I was working on that level, I realized, wow, this power to go into people's minds, which is the foundation of Psychonauts, is really invasive. Like, it's very invasive, incredibly, like, you know, seeing people's dreams. Like, you wouldn't think of reading someone's diary or their dream diary, but like going into someone's mind and then making changes is very invasive. And it just seemed wrong to do it without explicit permission.
Do you think Bob would mind if I took a look inside his mind?
That was the extent of the thought process behind it. Like, it just feels wrong to go so invasively in someone else's personal space, literally their mind, and to make any changes, especially even just going in to look around, seemed invasive enough to require explicit permission.
Would you mind if I snuck a peek inside your mind?
Oh, thank you. I haven't had a checkup since Ford went away.
This asking for consent on Raz's part in Psychonauts 2 is, in a way, the game criticizing the first game in the series' ignoring of consent. Raz's need to learn to ask for permission to enter people's minds becomes a part of his character's arc within the game.
I feel like the world has changed and we have all changed, and it's been, you know, in the last 15 years, I think, thought about things that, at least on a personal level, that I hadn't yet encountered or talked about so much openly back in those days.
Body's on loan from the mailroom. Hang on, borrowed lips wouldn't be right.
But it wasn't like, you know, in this game I'm gonna you know, teach these lessons. It was more just in writing these characters, these are the situations that were presented and the moral choices that were presented, and they just seemed to call for a certain treatment. So it felt like it organically came out of the subject matter of the story that we're telling.
I violated your trust and very idea of what it means to be a psychonaut. I guess I'm not ready for this after all.
You're right about violating trust. What you did was wrong. Very wrong. But, truth is, I pulled a similar stunt once.
Really?
All of this showcases how games can begin to subvert problems in their earlier depictions. And how it's also not necessarily wrong to show characters failing at consent, as long as the narrative critiques it, rather than simply taking it for granted as it was in the first game. Life is Strange True Colors, for example, does something similar. In the game, you have the power to read people's emotional states. However, at one point in the game, you're placed in a scenario that involves the character Charlotte, a widow who lost her partner due to an incident involving her child. At one point, you're allowed a choice to take away Charlotte's resentment and anger at her child, yet you would do so without Charlotte knowing. If you choose to do this as the player, however, Charlotte was unable to feel any real emotions for the rest of the game.
It's like when your leg falls asleep, and even though it's still attached, it's become something other than you. My whole life, I've always felt so deeply. But maybe this is better?
And won't be on your side at the story's climax.
There's something wrong with you, Alex. And now there's something wrong with me.
Your forcible denial of Charlotte's bodily autonomy leads her to a form of disassociation and PTSD, which can often occur when people's ability to consent is denied. However, if you respect Charlotte's bodily autonomy and let her keep her emotions, she'll be on your side later on, which is presented as a positive outcome. As a result, Life is Strange allows the player's choices to become part of the commentary of the game, showcasing the ramifications directly for the player's actions without taking away the player's ability to respect someone's bodily autonomy or not.
But this all leads us to our final question, because we've mainly been talking about consent between players and NPCs. But what about between the players and the developers? Because you see, that too is a relationship in which the developers often have more power and grant agency to the player. They quite literally build the worlds that we inhabit within a game and pick what choices we have or don't have. They literally have the power to decide what amount of agency we have within these worlds, and thus the amount of stuff that we're able to consent to within a game's world.
For example, in that situation in Life is Strange True Colors, you aren't given an option to ask Charlotte if she wants to have her emotions taken away or not.
What if she had said yes?
But the developers didn't program that as an option, taking away players' agency for the sake of the story that they wish to tell.
And these are all choices that developers make in every single game. That's just how games are made. You can't put every single option within a world into a game, because that would basically be nigh impossible for a developer to program. We're not making the Matrix here. At least, not yet, hopefully. But If that's the case, what if we started considering these developers' choices in terms of consent? What do players consent to when they enter into a game based on what the developers have made for them? What choices are the developers putting in front of them that they may choose to or not choose to take part in?
This question lied at the heart of a genuine concern in 2021 with Kit Fox Games' Boyfriend Dungeon, a dungeon crawler where you date personified versions of your weapons. In the game, however, you meet the blacksmith Eric, who turns out to be a manipulative and aggressive stalker. No matter what you do, he will follow you, text you, and come after you, mirroring how real-life stalkers often work to limit the agency of their victims.
But the game was controversial not because of this storyline alone, but because players weren't prepared for it.
Many players didn't know that this storyline was in the game and so were shocked to discover that it was there. And as a result, many players took to Twitter to voice that they hadn't consented to a storyline about a stalker.
Which may have caused distress to many who had had that experience in real life and then played the game without warning.
I did not consent to this. I know for some games this is just par for the course, but it's 2021, and I didn't ask Boyfriend Dungeon to place me into an extremely distressing situation which, from what I can tell, I cannot opt out of.
Many pointed out that the game's content warning didn't adequately warn about this particular storyline,
leading the developer to quickly fix this.
By failing to have a comprehensive content warning, the game's developers didn't allow the players the full informed choice to opt in or out of the story, to choose to play the game or not if they didn't want to engage with that type of storyline.
Psychonauts 2 also had an extensive and clear content warning, something Tim Schafer worked hard to get right, even making sure he consulted with people outside of himself just to get the wording of the disclaimer correct to ensure players knew exactly what they were in for and what needed to be expressed to them before playing.
Yeah, I think that was a really positive experience. I wrote that and consulted with Dr. B from Take This. And it changed with the input from the fans. Some of the early tests and fans added things like that vomit could be a triggering thing for, I guess real people. It never would occur to me that there are other things in the game that could be upset. I knew that the dental horror, I knew some of the people on the original team had a very strong aversion to going to the dentist, and I know that that's a deeply held thing for people. So that one went in automatically, and then some of the other ones were added just people saying like, "Hey, by the way," it flows out of doing art. Like if you make art, you're always thinking making connection with people, and about expressing something emotional and something creative, and having other people have a reaction to it. So you're always thinking about what a reaction you'd want to have. Not that you can control that, but you're like, I'm making a horror film, so I want people to feel scared right here. I'm making a love story, I want people to feel romantic right here. Like you are trying to, bring summon certain emotions. And so you probably don't have the emotion of, probably don't have the intent of saying like, right here, I want to do lasting psychological harm. Or I want to make someone remember the worst period of their life or something. Mm-hmm. You don't usually have those intents. So it's just, you always are thinking about your audience, the impact you have on them. And that mental health advisory is just a natural expression of that.
Oh, is that all? Good. I thought it was something more worrying, like kissing.
Moving on, many people also took issue with Boyfriend Dungeon further,
arguing that the stalker storyline should be removed entirely, rather than it be something simply divulged in the content warning of the game.
Yet, the stalker storyline was essential to what the developers wanted to depict with their narrative.
This choice to take part in that narrative should be informed, yes, which a content warning allows for. Additionally, you can and should critique what a game's story or message is, and you can argue that you find it harmful or wrong. But this storyline in Boyfriend Dungeon's whole point is to discuss stalking, and removing it because you didn't consent to the story being there ignores that it was the story that developers wanted to tell.
But this isn't as black and white as it first appears, because what if the story the developers wanted to tell goes against the choices that they had given to the player earlier in the game about the sexual agency that the gamers had made?
For example, Assassin's Creed Odyssey allowed you to play as a boy or girl, and many players chose to play their female player character as gay, having their Cassandra date only women within the game. Yet, the game's DLC, Legacy of the First Blade, ended by forcing gamers into a heterosexual relationship, directly denying players choices of their sexuality that they had made earlier. Gamers got so upset by this that Ubisoft even apologized for removing players' agency that they had previously given.
And on top of all of this, what if gamers want to play a game but don't want to consent to violent or sexual imagery within it?
For example, Monty Cook Gaming published a tabletop RPG guide called Consent in Gaming that outlines rules for creating games that are affirming for all, even creating checklists that someone could give to their DM to say what they are and aren't comfortable with before they start playing. And video games are implementing similar changes to accessibility settings, allowing players to turn off blood or sexual imagery or more within the options menu, which is fantastic.
Yet this also creates a gray area.
Because certainly, while sometimes blood in a game, for example, isn't needed, but a nice bit of immersion that a player can choose to engage with or not, what if seeing excessive amounts of blood or sexual imagery is part of the story the game is trying to tell?
And turning it off would make the game's story have been communicated less effectively, if really at all.
For example, The Last of Us Part 2 is a game in part about how excessive violence towards others leads us to dehumanize them. So would being able to turn off Ellie's brutal stabbings damage the effectiveness of the game's message?
This became a controversy recently surrounding the game Dead Space, which gave content warnings within the game and allowed players to turn them on if they wished to. This was an amazing choice by the developers of the Dead Space remake because it allowed players the chance to choose whether or not they wish to engage with imagery that might cause them some form of distress. Giving players more accessibility choices like this is amazing because it allows players to be able to consent to what they wish to within a game. But this can also go the other way too. What if a player wishes to turn something off due to a bias or a bigotry?
For example, what if someone demands an option to turn off having to see LGBTQ people within a game, for instance? In fact, The Sims 4 recently added sexual orientations to their character creator, and some people demanded that they be allowed to turn it off, to which the devs responded.
Can you turn this feature off? No. While we try to give players the option to toggle certain gameplay features, LGBTQIA+ identities are a fact of life, and not a toggle to be switched on and off.
Which is a fantastic response. And in fact, I actually spoke to the Sims character creator developer about writing this response and their thinking behind it.
Whenever we add a feature that substantively changes the gameplay loop of The Sims, a discussion that always comes up is whether or not we should allow it to be toggled on and off. And we were firm early on that this wasn't something that we wanted to be a toggle. In the times we're living in, strong positive affirmations of the queer community are really important. And I think we wanted to make sure that we stood by the community by making this choice. And I think it's one of those things where what kind of message does it send if we add like a representation feature and people just turn it off, right? Like that's not really the message we want to send. So that's where that came from.
Yet, given the current demonization and politicization of trans and queer identities, one could easily see a developer wanting to avoid any controversy and not being so direct in their response. In fact, this quite recently happened with the video game Hogwarts Legacy, where people asked the developers specifically about the transgender controversies relating to J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter world. And sadly, the developers didn't come out and say that they supported trans people, just that they supported all people's rights. This is sadly a really disappointing response because it's not really directly talking about the issue and not making their stance clear around whether or not they support trans people. And this isn't to say that the people who said this statement were anti-trans or transphobic or anything like that, but just pointing to the fact that they aren't able to directly confront the controversy.
Because they don't want to affect sales of their games. But it leads to people not talking about issues pertaining to marginalized communities, such as the trans community in this case.
It's something we often see, for example, with the censorship or denial or hiding of LGBTQ characters in film and media in general.
Where's the line where the player's agency takes precedent and the story the developers wish to tell begins in these situations? And the only answer we can give is that there's no clear answer. We're talking about art, and art frankly defies clear black and white distinctions quite often. But most importantly, a player's most significant moment of consent is choosing to play a game at all, and giving players as much knowledge beforehand helps with that decision. No one owes any game their attention or focus. We get to choose whether we engage with it or not, and giving us as much knowledge beforehand around that game, the context of the game, and what's within the game helps players know whether they can choose to engage with it. Be it through content warnings, marketing, or accessibility options, all of that helps with that choice.
But also, stories that challenge us and push us outside of our comfort zones can be helpful to us. But it also gets us back to consent, and how we should be the ones to dictate our bodies.
As all of this shows, consent is both a complicated and a straightforward topic simultaneously. It's very simple, in that it's all about respecting someone's wishes for their own body, and that's it. And listening to what they have to say about themselves and respecting that, and giving them as much agency as possible around their own body. Yet, consent does become complicated because of our own biases and limits on our ability to empathize with others that can often obfuscate that ability to listen and respect others, as well as the fact that within games, we're literally creating worlds. And as a result, we have to constantly be thinking about what abilities we are allowing the players to have when it comes to their agency.
Gaming provides an excellent and unique avenue to discuss consent, because it's all about navigating agency and desire more so than any other medium. But games are also influenced by our biases, as well as our willingness to use games as fantasy and seeing others as literal non-player characters, and making invisible things that should be outright stated.
At the end of the day, though,
our understanding of consent in gaming has come a long way. We've gone from taking consent as implicit, implied, or even outright ignored, to making understanding consent a part of the story. But there's still a long way to go. Like men being seen as always consenting, to the idea that coercing consent is acceptable. And even beyond that, there are some issues that may never be answered, as they're core to the questions of games as an artistic medium and art in general. All art, and especially pop culture, influence our understanding of sex and consent. So, perhaps more so than any other medium, gaming is the most necessary place to get consent right, because both are all about agency. Gaming allows us the most human chance to understand the importance of consent in a way that not only informs how we think about it, but can allow us to practice how it works in real time. In the end, consent, like games, is all about figuring out how best to navigate the world in front of you, to trust those around you and use the tools you're given, and respect how others use their tools. And, like any game, you get better at consent as you learn how to use your tools to enter into the flow state. Because as I said, consent is always required, and it can always be sexy.